Letters from Spain. Letter 18. Spanish cities. Hello. It seems that I suddenly have an awful lot of time to work with because of this surge of coronavirus cases in Madrid. Last time I checked, it was over 7,000 in the country, and I'm sure that's going to change very shortly. It keeps going up rapidly. Anyway, all the schools have been closed. I've been sent home for at least 2 weeks. I bet it's going to be a lot longer than that. On Friday, last Friday, they ordered all the shops and restaurants to be closed. And today is the first day of a nationwide lockdown that, again, they say is going to last 2 weeks, but I bet it's going to last longer. Nobody's allowed on the streets except to go to work, buy medicine or groceries. And most people are not going to work because they've closed all the shops and everything, right? So the streets are mostly dead. And if the police catch you, and there are lots of police around, you can get a fine for at least 100 euros. So most people are staying at home. In spite of these hardships and these rather harsh measures, I think the Spanish people are mostly taking it well, you know? True, there's no toilet paper left in any of the shops. I've checked. Thankfully, I stocked up before, but apart from this panic buying, people are keeping their spirits up, you know? They're keeping their spirits up every day at 8 o'clock. All the people have been gathering on the balconies to cheer and applaud the hardworking medical personnel. So that's been quite nice, gotta say. Nice moment of communal get-togetherness. Something, we really need when we're just sitting at home, feeling quite isolated. Anyway, honestly, it's a pretty surreal feeling. A few weeks ago, coronavirus, was just a thing happening in China. And then, it was just an Italian problem, something in Italy. And now it's global, and it's certainly here in Madrid. Madrid's one of the major epicenters now. But of course, this is going to change. And if any of you are listening in America, I'd say get ready, because I would be very surprised if most of America didn't follow the same pattern. It seems like lockdown's the only thing that works against this virus. So anyway, so far, I'm safe and sound. I'm feeling pretty good. The city of Madrid, not doing so well. I mean, it's kind of dead. It's a ghost town. All these precautions that are necessary to slow down the spread of coronavirus, they go so totally against the grain of Spanish culture. I've talked about this before. Spanish people, they love to be outside. They love to be in public. They love to congregate. They greet each other with kisses. They have no issue with physical contact. Spanish people love a crowd. The more crowded a bar, the better. They'll pack in. So, and these qualities for me, under normal circumstances, that's what make Spanish culture and Spanish cities so great. There's so much life. The city centers are always bustling with life. You always feel like you're in there's just a lot of energy, a lot of ambient energy. You feel it. A big part of Spanish culture, I think one of the main reasons why this is such a big part of Spanish culture, is the layout of the cities itself. And this is what I want to talk about in today's podcast. Every major Spanish city predates the invention of the car by centuries. And so the historical parts of all these cities, Madrid included, are always easily walkable. The invention of the car was bad for city life. You can see the evidence of this almost anywhere in America, and also in the parts of European cities that have been built to accommodate car travel. For example, on the outskirts of Madrid, once you get from the inner city, from the city center to the outskirts, you enter into a kind of industrial park everywhere. And all the buildings are low-lying, not very tall. They're all spread out. You don't have any motivation to put things close by if everyone's going to be driving. And you don't have any motivation to build up in any one place. And the result is very ugly. You have endless asphalt, shabby buildings, nobody on the street. It's a dead zone. So I think you could really clearly see the bad effect that the car has had on city planning if you look at a place that I worked for a long time. It's a city called Rivas Bacia, Madrid. Now, of course, I don't want to insult Rivas because the people of Rivas are really quite lovely in my experience. Uh, and if any of you are listening, hello. I doubt you are listening, though. No one is. But anyway, I think the city itself of Rivas, and by that I mean the buildings and the streets and so forth, not the people. The city itself embodies everything that I dislike about modern cities. The major problem is the zoning. There are zones for single residency houses, zones for apartment buildings, and zones for restaurants. Most of the shopping is concentrated in one giant mall. So every purpose gets its own zone. You see, every sort of building. And the result is deadening because there's hardly any variation to relieve your eye. All these houses and buildings look exactly the same. One house, it's too repetitious. It's almost depressing, really. Even worse, compared to other Spanish cities, there's very little life on the street, For example, when I was working in Bribas, I had a bunch of private classes. I had to walk from private class to private class. And during that time, I wouldn't see more than 3 people during the whole time, from one place to another. It's simply a place built for cars. There are no good places to gather on the street. There are no plazas. There are no natural places to get together. And as a result, the street life is dead, which is very unusual in Spain. Now, it's true, Rivas has some big parks, but in my experience, the parks are often pretty empty too, I found it kind of depressing, as I said. And again, this isn't a reflection of the people of Rivas, who are very, very nice people. But for me, going from the endlessly similar neighborhoods of the new part of Rivas, and that's most of Rivas because it's a city that has grown very, very quickly. But if you go from the new part of Rivas to the tiny little old center, it was always a relief because there you found bars and cafes and a central square with some benches, the things you normally expect from a Spanish city, a place built for walking, a place built for hanging out. That's really what it comes down to, hanging out. Now, this problem was diagnosed by Jane Jacobs, the famous American writer on city planning. Cities are vibrant when they're mixed use. That is, then there are lots of different sorts of things in the same neighborhood. And when there are lots of different things in the same neighborhood, there are many more reasons for people to be there at different times of day. And so there are many more people on the street. And when there are more people on the streets becomes more interesting and also safer. It naturally reduces the crime rate, at least for violent crime, maybe not for pickpocketing, since there are always bystanders. And in general, I think this is just one of the chief delights of city life. Basically, when you live in a city, one of the main pleasures is just seeing the human zoo. It's a constant human zoo, and it's fascinating. A high population density can also support a wider variety of businesses, which is another one of the great pleasures of city life. There are the cafes, restaurants, and bars, of course. And, nowadays they're completely shut down and empty, but most of the time they're packed. Honestly, I wonder what is the furthest you could go in Spain from the furthest you can go from a bar, because the country is just totally covered in bars. This is, again, one of the great joys of Spanish life. If you want a glass of wine, a coffee, a bite to eat, normally you could just choose from any one of the 3 to 6 establishments that are in eyesight. It's You don't have to think about where to go. It's just constantly there. It's crazy. I mean, you may think I'm joking, but Spain is actually the country with the highest density of bars in the world. To give you some idea of this, the southern province of the country, Andalusia, has more bars in it than Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Ireland combined. And by the way, Andalusia has less than half as many people as these four countries. Another things that's not in short supply in Spain are the supermarkets. And by the way, this is one reason why I'm not really worried that we're going to run out of food here during the lockdown. My neighborhood is a good example. Within a 10-minute walk from my front door, there are 14 supermarkets. 14! And many of them are quite big. These four supermarkets represent 7 different brands. Some of them are Spanish, like Mercadona and Dia. One of them is French, like Carrefour. And one is German, Lidl. And of course, this is not to mention the many butchers, vegetable shops, and bakeries nearby. You know, honestly, the amount of food that's constantly available is like almost overwhelming. Just the other day, I was walking on a street I don't normally walk on near my house, and I came across a very modern-looking butcher shop. And it had the kind of meat, any kind of meat you could wish for, you know, if you're not a vegan. So I finally found this type of Spanish sausage that I really like, which is called chorizo criollo, or Creole chorizo. And the name doesn't really make sense because it's not really Creole, but anyway, it's pretty delicious. It's the closest thing you could buy in Spain to an Italian sausage, like we eat a lot in America. My point is that normally you're pretty spoiled when it comes to food selection, even if some things that are common in the United States are a lot less common in Spain. For example, like broccoli rabe, I've never seen it in Spain. What's the deal with that? I want broccoli rabe. It's delicious. Anyway, so there are 2 types of shops, very, very common in Spain, that are most often run by immigrants. One is the humble kebab shop, the most popular fast food option in Europe. I actually live on top of a kebab shop, and the smell of spiced meats wafts up all day, which gives me these sort of strange cravings. Of course, the kebab shops are closed too, which is, I think, a mistake. I think the government has to reopen the kebab shops during this time of crisis. This is what we need. Anyway, the other shop is called an alimentación, which is like a corner store. You know, we have them in New York, where you could buy snacks, basic amenities, and alcohol. And, you know, in Spain, you don't need a liquor license to sell alcohol, so everywhere has booze, including McDonald's. These shops, the alimentaciones, are normally owned by Chinese people, or very often owned by Chinese people. So Spanish people normally call them chinos. And I'm personally unclear whether this is considered or should be considered offensive. Chino, by the way, is also the standard way to refer to a Chinese person and a Chinese restaurant. And there are also, there are a lot of Chinese restaurants in Spain. Anyway, speaking of my own neighborhood, what else should I mention? I think by really any standard, there's a pretty impressive range of businesses here. There are sports stores, 2 sports stores, for example, and they're not chains. There's a nice little one up the street where they have really good deals on sweatpants and sweatshirts. And there's one around the corner from my apartment that has really everything. It's huge. It has everything from fishing rods to weightlifting machines, anything you would really want. Speaking of lifting weights, there's also a gym locally owned that my brother goes to, or did go to before they closed it down. And Retiro Park is just 5 minutes up the street where I normally go running. And again, Retiro is shut down too right now. Oh, so sad. Can't talk about anything without talking about the coronavirus. Well, anyway. the longer I've lived in this neighborhood, and my neighborhood is called Pacifico, the more I've come to appreciate it. And I think this is because my neighborhood is fairly typical of Spanish towns. You know, it's not a big place to go out at night, admittedly, but it's a historical neighborhood, and it's right next to the central train station Atocha. So for that reason, has quite good public transportation. It's also near the square Conde de Casal, which has tons of buses, and it's near another bus station, Mendez Alvaro, big bus station. So the amount of public transportation that's available is is absurd. You know, you're spoiled for choices. But anyway, I think my neighborhood embodies a lot of what is good in Spanish cities. Speaking of the physical layout, the streets are not too big and they're not too long. And when you have a lot of little streets crisscrossing, it gives you a high density of shops within easy walking distance. And this is essential, right? It allows people to easily move around, allows shops to stay in business. So, as a result, while the streets are usually not crowded, there's also hardly a moment when the streets are not empty. There's hardly a moment when the streets are empty, I should say. Whew. Unless there's a pandemic. A few years ago, Pacifico was a pretty sleepy part of the city with lots of older folks, but nowadays the neighborhood does seem to be gentrifying, and I'm sure that I'm contributing to this process. Down the street from where I live, there's an axe throwing business where you could take turns hurling a hatchet at a wooden target. There's also a fancy dried goods store with all these different types of pastas, flours, and exotic spices. And then there are all these bio shops and organic produce and different medicinal herbs. And there's a big technology store and a cool bookstore that also serves coffee and craft beer and carrot cake. And we also had a specialized craft beer store, but they just shut down. Anyway, so you get my point. There's a lot of stuff in my neighborhood. And I think that this is typical of many neighborhoods in Spain. They're mixed use. You know, my neighborhood doesn't only have shops and cafes. My neighborhood also has the central offices of Renfe. So there are lots of business people in the area too. And it's walkable because everything is fairly compact. And it's well connected with public transportation, another very important thing. In a way, my neighborhood is the antithesis of places that are built around cars, even though there are cars in the neighborhood, obviously. And I think that the result speaks for itself. It's more attractive, it's more interesting, and it's all around more livable. And, you know, there's another added bonus to living in a Spanish city. It's the history. You know, in my neighborhood, which is a pretty quiet and not a famous neighborhood, it's not a neighborhood that people visit for tourism. But even in my neighborhood, there are some historical buildings that are important. For example, quite close by to me is the engine hall, the Nave de Motores, which is like a power station where it has 3 massive diesel engine generators, which were built for the first generation of the Madrid metro. So basically, there are these huge diesel engines that were used when the power grid in Madrid wasn't strong enough to support the metro. In fact, I wrote about this in my blog, but these giant diesel engines were originally used in a World War I German warship. You know, they're incredibly big, and it must have been so hot and loud when they were turned on in that little building. Anyway, not far from that is the Royal Tapestry Factory. So this is just one of many royal factories, and the royal factories were established in the 1700s by the Bourbon monarchs of Spain, and they were trying to emulate the French mercantile model, which was put into place by Colbert. So these were like state-run organizations that made luxury goods for the royal family. I don't really know the economic justification behind making them state-owned, but this is the idea. So, for example, there's a royal glass factory in the town of La Granja, which is near one of Spain's great palaces. The tapestry factory in my neighborhood is a big brick building with a big smokestack, and this is where they made some of the finest neoclassical tapestries for the Spanish court. Goya himself made designs for these tapestries, and the original paintings by Goya for the tapestries are still hanging on the top floor of the Prado. So I think nowadays um, this factory is run by a nonprofit, but I don't know if you could visit it. I need to look into that. Anyway, quite close to this factory are two more historical landmarks: the Royal Basilica of Our Lady of Atocha and the Pantheon of Illustrious Men. So the first is an important church that's home to one of the many venerated images of the Virgin, a carving of the Virgin or statue. This basilica has been a center of religious and royal life in Madrid for quite a long time. Bartolomé de las Casas is even buried there, and he was a monk who was one of the first Spaniards to raise awareness about the cruelty of colonization in the Americas. Quite ahead of his time. Next door is the Pantheon, which used to be a convent. Now, in the 1800s, lots of convents were seized from the church by the state, and this one was converted into a kind of celebration for civic Spaniards. And so basically, in the cloister of the old convent, they have elaborate funerary monuments that are sort of distributed around. It's really quite a beautiful place, even though I personally have never heard of any of the people buried there. Well, anyway, it seems like I started a podcast about Spanish city planning, but I'm just talking about how much I like my neighborhood. But I do think that my neighborhood illustrates the ways that a city can be a joyous place. I think that it's really a healthier and a saner way to live than having everything spread out like they're on little islands, making a car necessary. Cars are great. Cars are convenient. But you can't have a community of cars, man. You need to have a community of people. I think modern city planners should take a look at these historical neighborhoods and do their best to emulate them and recreate them. Otherwise we're going to be condemned to a life of seclusion and isolation, cooped up in our homes. Like we have coronavirus all the time, It's not a good way to live. We need human interaction. Well, unfortunately, even the best neighborhoods that exist are in constant risk of being rendered unlivable by rising rents. And this is a consequence of real estate investing and gentrification. Basically, rents rise when property values rise. Property values rise when people invest in real estate. And also rents rise when apartments are taken off the market because they're being used as Airbnbs for tourists. So, how can we combat this? How can we create a livable, beautiful city? Oh, sorry, I think I just touched the mic. I apologize. Anyway, I think maybe it's significant that Vienna, which is often considered the most livable city in the world, has extensive public housing projects. For almost half the population are living in public housing. At the moment, Madrid's own housing market is pretty unregulated, to say the least. And I think this could really lead to a situation where average, everyday people are pushed out of the center of Madrid into the outskirts. And this is, the city gets hollowed out. And it's already happened in London and New York. And it just really kills a lot of the liveliness that makes these places attractive to begin with, because the local shops are replaced with chains. The property values rise. It just becomes a place for tourists who are paying for overpriced meals from bad restaurants. It's not good. The good cities are livable, and by livable, that means affordable. How do you keep it that way? That's a challenge. Whatever the government could do to prevent this situation from happening, I welcome it. Although what exactly is the best thing to do, that's something I don't feel qualified to talk about. Anyways, I'm counting down the days until this coronavirus thing is over, and I could finally enjoy the beauties of Spanish civic life once again. Who knows when that'll be? Will it be 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks? Oof. I hope it's over soon. Until then, thank you.